This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. I am your host, Darren McKee, and with me today is a special guest, Spencer Greenberg, who is the founder of clearerthinking.org, which offers over 80 free interactive learning modules teaching critical thinking and behavior change skills. He's also the founder of Transparent Replications, which replicates papers in top psychology journals shortly after they're published to evaluate their quality. Finally, he is the host of the Clearer Thinking podcast, a podcast about ideas that matter. Welcome, Spencer Greenberg.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great to have you. So, as we just did in the intro, you do a lot of replication of psychology papers and articles, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Psychology replication and whether it's good, bad, and the ugly. I covered some of psychology being in crisis 7-8 years ago, so listeners of the show will know that we sometimes cover topics and we point out that science is great, but it's not perfect. So I thought I'd walk through a bit with Spencer how, I guess, psychology tends to be done, the science of it, and then we'll discuss about some of the problems and limitations it has, which leads to issues of replication, and then some of his work trying to replicate some of these ideas.
Fantastic.
Great. Wonderful. So when you think about psychology as a science, how does it done? How do people do psychological science, Spencer?
Well, I think you could think of all sciences as working generally the same way at a very high level, which is first you make observations about the world. Once you've made observations about the world, you're going to hypothesize based on them. Then you're going to go design a study or an experiment to test those hypotheses. And finally, you're going to communicate your results at the end. And so just to give kind of a more concrete example, imagine you're a clinical psychologist working with patients, and maybe you just notice anecdotally that your patients that had a certain type of parent when they were growing up seem to be more likely to have depression today. Right? So you've kind of observed the world, you've noticed a pattern, now you've developed a hypothesis based on this, and now you go design a study. Maybe your study will collect a bunch of data about the parenting style of people's parents and whether they have depression today, and you'll attempt to control for a lot of confounding variables, essentially alternative explanations for why there could be a relationship, and you'll see if that relationship between the parenting style of their parents and the depression today holds up. And if you find that it holds up, then you'll publicize your result to the world, ideally so that other scientists can go verify it, see if they get the same result, they can challenge it, see if they find flaws in your thinking. And that's kind of the process, whether it's psychology or biology or even physics.
That is a great overview. Yes, generally, you have the hypothesis, you test it, you try to find a result, and you try to publish it. Of course, we know it's very difficult to do a lot of these things, and psychology is also very broad. You mentioned clinical, but there's numerous other aspects, from developmental, where you're looking at younger children, or even within the experimental paradigm of psychology, there's cognitive science, there's more social psychology, and that sort of thing. So it has seemed to be, for years now, we're aware of some sort of replication crisis in psychology. How do you describe that?
Yeah, so you'd really like to think that if you go read a paper in a top journal, that you can trust what it says. You could say, okay, I believe this result. They really got the effect. If someone else were going to go try the same experiment, they should get the same result. But unfortunately, about 10 years ago, there was a real calamity where people began to realize that a lot of these results, if you went and redid the experiment and you tried to really faithfully get the same result by following what the original researchers did, you didn't get the same result very often. And the amount of replication failure, people debated a lot. But if you look at big studies where they tried to replicate many, many different papers, often they find that they were only able to replicate maybe 40 to 50% of them. Now, I think things are a little bit better than that because not all of the replications were perfectly faithful to the original experimental design. And so the more different those studies were from the original experiment, the more difference you might expect. In addition, even a really well done replication has some chance of having a false negative. So there's some chance that just by bad luck, it didn't get the same result. So I think my best guess is if you look at papers from 10 to 15 years ago, probably about 40% of them wouldn't replicate if you did a really well done replication.
Which is still a pretty high number. Yeah, so for people who don't read these papers, there's a method section which describes how they do it, which is why other people can replicate it. And ideally, you can work with the original researchers, as I believe some of these replication projects have done. Before we get into some more details about this, let's briefly talk about some of the basic constraints or incentives or misaligned incentives that go with doing any sort of science. You mentioned there's a false positive that could happen, but there's also false negatives, a file drawer problem, and publishing issues. I wonder if you could speak to those.
Yeah, absolutely. Fundamentally, if you're an academic scientist, you have to publish a certain number of papers in top journals in order to get the coveted spots in the field, to get the tenure track and eventually the tenured position. It's very, very competitive. The vast majority of people that are gunning for these positions don't get them. So that means that you have an extremely strong incentive to get published in this relatively small set of journals that are considered prestigious in whatever your subdiscipline is. And because of that, there's a lot of incentive to cut corners. Now, I will say that I think a lot of the corner cutting was not explicit where people felt that they were cheating. I think a lot of it was more implicit, where if you're using methods that are a little bit shoddy, it was easier to get a really positive seeming result that could get published. And so there's sort of this indirect incentive to do maybe not the best forms of research, but it's very easy to convince yourself that what you're doing is okay, especially if you see many people around you using these methods, especially if you see your thesis advisor using these methods, especially if you don't see anyone being punished for using these methods, you can kind of justify them. Now, this is really different than committing fraud. Fraud is where you literally make up data or you lie about what you did in your experiment. What I'm talking about here is what's known as p-hacking. So p-hacking is where you kind of use somewhat fishy methods to make it look like you got a statistically significant result when maybe it wouldn't actually replicate because it was just a false positive or was just due to some chance effect. And so examples of p-hacking would be you do your experiment, the result is not quite statistically significant, so you say, well, I didn't throw away outliers. Maybe that's, the problem is that I have bad outliers. So then you go and you look at the outliers, you take them away, and you're like, well, now it's statistically significant, but that's very easy to justify because maybe you should have removed the outliers from the beginning, right? Or maybe you do your experiment and you measure the result a few different ways, and you find that measuring it one of those ways, you get a nice statistically significant result, and then you kind of come up with a post hoc rationalization, while maybe the other two ways weren't really as good a way to measure it at all. So then you basically write your paper about that one way that the study worked out, and you kind of either don't mention or kind of just bury at the bottom of your paper the fact that it didn't work if you did it the other two ways.
Yeah, I think it's very hard for people who aren't in it to realize all the ways that one can accidentally do science poorly. And you alluded to some of them. It could be that, stats is very hard. When I was doing a master's in psychology, I'm like, if you want to be a good psychologist, you pretty much have to be a statistician, or at least know a statistician to help you with a lot of this stuff. Because as you alluded, you could do analyses a certain way. And then it seems like, I could just do it another way to see what it says. But every time you try a different method, you kind of reduce the validity of what you're going to end up finding. Or, as you said, because there's this pressure to publish in top journals, because journals have a bias towards positive findings, there's this file drawer problem, as they say, which could be within a lab, right? They try many times to find something and they don't find it and they bury it. But there could also be the charitable interpretation. Let's say there's 20 labs out there. They're all studying the same thing. 19 of them don't find it. One of them does. The one that does doesn't know about the other 19. So they think they have a so-called legitimate result because it's all well and good and they followed everything as they should. But overall, as a whole, they've ended up producing something that doesn't quite match reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And one way to think about this is imagine you have a coin flipping competition where you have hundreds of people competing to be the best coin flipper. At the end of the day, some people are going to get heads, 10 times in a row if you have enough people competing. And so even in a world where there's no real results, where everything's just pure noise, you'll sometimes seem like you get a real effect, right? Now, of course, in psychology, it's not nearly that bad. There really are real effects there that people can find. But the point is, with lots and lots of people testing lots and lots of things, some of these results are just the result of noise. And then if you use shoddy statistical methods, you can greatly increase the chance that a noisy result looks like a real result. And so that's what p-hacking is about. It's about all these kind of fishy methods that kind of increase the chance of a false positive.
Right. Now, my understanding of a lot of this replication crisis, at least the stuff that made the headlines, was a lot of the so-called famous psychology results tend to be the more social psychology or social priming. The power pose is supposed to make you more confident, or perhaps, the pencil in your teeth makes you happier, these sorts of things. And it was less so other domains of psychology. Is that correct, or have I misunderstood?
Yeah, the replication rate in different domains of psychology does seem to differ. And it depends on how thinly you want to slice it up. So if you look at what's known as social priming, and so social priming are these results where some very subtle thing in the environment primes an idea in people's minds and then gets a large behavior change out of them. So classic finding would be something like if you give someone a warm mug full of warm tea, they might act differently. Like maybe they'll act more warmly or they'll think of people around them as being more warm. Or another example, classic example was priming people with words about being old, like oldness related words, caused people to walk slower out of the experimental lab when they left, right? So these kinds of social priming effects seem to just basically not exist at all, or if they exist, they seem to be very rare and very weak. But there were hundreds of experiments claiming that these effects were real. And I just want to contrast this for a moment. Social priming is different than what you might call semantic priming. Semantic priming is a real result. Semantic priming would be something like, let's say you give people a bunch of words related to grocery stores, like, Apple, checkout, dollar bill, whatever. You can actually change the probability that later they think of other grocery store related words. That kind of effect does hold up. Like priming people with one concept will increase the probability of other concepts related being available to them. Social priming is different. And that's the thing that's really seems to just not hold up barely at all.
Yeah, I as a playful heuristic, if there's an interesting finding that someone has made a TED talk about, it's probably less likely to replicate than the other findings that are more interesting just to researchers.
Well, there's this weird thing where if your results are shoddy, it's easier to get really astounding counterintuitive results, right? Because you're not limited by reality. A lot of times reality is not that surprising because we understand it to some extent, right?
Right. And if one sort of takes this social priming against the supposed reality, which didn't quite replicate, but at the time, if it took it to be how the world was, one would be sort of bouncing around in all these dramatic fashions, whether, again, someone used a word that relates to older people, or maybe they gave you a warm mug. And I guess your fluctuations would be very large as you encounter different parts of the world in terms of how you treat people socially, how you act socially. And that doesn't quite seem to be the case. I mean, of course, we're influenced by our environment, what we eat and what people say, but not to the extent that social priming would have led us to believe.
Yeah, it does seem, in retrospect, a little bit a priori implausible that there's such huge effects of all these random things in our environment. So I think, there probably some skepticism was warranted. But on the other hand, hindsight's 20/20. It's very easy to look back and say, oh, that's ridiculous. Now that we know none of this stuff replicates, right?
Right. And then wonder if you can just sort of like give yourself the placebo, like I'm in a power pose, I feel better. Isn't that true? How could that not be true, right?
Yeah, so power posing, I think, is a really interesting example. And I think it illustrates something that is kind of counterintuitive, which is, so basically, let me give the story of power posing, if that works for you.
Oh, great. Sure.
So basically, there were researchers that wanted to study the effects of body posture on how you feel and how you behave. And so they had people adopt what they call power poses, which are kind of positions of projecting high power, maybe your hands on your hips, that kind of thing. And they found kind of remarkable results where people who were doing power poses, they reported feeling more powerful, like subjectively, when you asked how powerful do you feel, but they also behaved differently. They actually took more risks, and they also found in blood tests that their cortisol levels were changed. So quite dramatic effects from just adopting a different body posture for a short amount of time.
Right.
Now, what ended up happening is that after a while, these results became incredibly famous due to a TED Talk it was one of the most viewed TED Talks of all time at the time when it came out. And I think that actually led to some extent to a backlash from psychologists because, they're seeing this result get blasted to the moon and get so much popular attention. And a lot of people were skeptical that this finding was legit. And so people went and tried to replicate it. And indeed, they found that they had trouble replicating the effects. They did not find the cortisol effects. They did not find the risk-taking effects. The subjective feelings of power effects, those are really interesting. And we actually ran our own replication, a really large replication. I think it was about 1,000 subjects. And we found that indeed, power posing did produce the self-reported effects of feeling more powerful. However, the effect size was very, very small. So we're talking like it made people feel very slightly more powerful, which was very different than sort of the original story in the TED Talk about how there's this incredible trick that's going to change your life, right? It's more like there's this little cute trick that may make you feel slightly more powerful. And, maybe that's cool, but it's not necessarily life-changing. But I think because there was so much backlash, because people, were quite upset about it getting so much attention, I think people went almost a bit too far. And a lot of people now are convinced that power posing doesn't work, whereas I think actually the balance of evidence, if you look at all the studies done, suggests that it does make people feel slightly more powerful It's just that maybe that's not such a big deal. And it's just a kind of self-report measure anyway.
I think that's a great example because there's many things to learn from it, right, in different ways. Certainly, if one is standing, hands on hips, a bit like Superman, that usually would make someone feel, I don't know, a bit more empowered at least, if not powerful, as opposed to be completely hunched over, slumped over, bad posture, and so on, right? So it's not like there's nothing here intuitively that makes sense.
Exactly.
But you also mentioned something very important, which is effect size. And most of the time, any media news coverage of any scientific finding often neglects effect size. And by this, we just mean the size of the effect. How large is the thing, right? It does matter whether something exists in the world, like whether eating an M&M will provide you calories, but a bag of M&Ms is not the same as one M&M. And often when you see scientific findings being reported, people can't help but think like it's the bag of M&Ms when maybe it's just one M&M, or there's like a fraction of a percent difference or a small percentage difference, which is interesting if you're just studying the world and you're academics. But for the average person, sometimes these effect sizes, they almost just wash out with all the other things they do in their life. And so I just wish effect size was a concept that was more popular and was reported on more so.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think part of the reason that there's a de-emphasis on effect size is because the standard for publication for a long time in psychology and related fields has been finding a result that's quote unquote statistically significant, which is a technical term that means that the p-value is less than 0.05. And we could go into that or we could leave that for another day. But basically, by having the focus be on, is it quote statistically significant, you don't need to show that the effect is large in order to prove that. So basically the bar that was set by journals didn't require showing a large effect. It merely required showing a result that seemed to be unlikely to be due to chance. And so that kind of de-emphasized how big the effect was.
Yeah, I also think that phrase, statistically significant, which in theory is fine on its own, because it has that word significant and that's used in normal conversation, it's so misleading because something can be statistically significant but not so-called actually significant. And I don't know what a better term would be, like academically important. If someone said, oh, look, there's some findings that are academically important, we're like, well, are they actually important? So like, no, they're just important to academics who study this stuff, but you can go about your day and it won't really matter much.
I prefer the phrase probably not due to noise. That's really what we're talking about. Like statistically significant is like probably not due to noise, but definitely not due to noise, right?
Well, right. And that's, but you're also in it. So the average person, like, what do you mean noise? You're like, well, wait, that's another concept which has to do with sort of like, random background things as opposed to the thing where the signal and the noise, as they say. But that's also terminology that for the average person, once they're familiar with it, it's great. But, they may not have as much familiarity as we do. Well, now that we have some of the foundation out of the way, and also just as a quick note, I don't want to just harp on psychology. I mean, a lot of other disciplines also have replication crises, just so everyone knows. It isn't just psychology. There's similar issues and patterns pervade. But that said, we're here to talk about Spencer's work in other replication domains. So, Spencer, tell us about the work you've done and some of the things you've replicated, and what are the most interesting findings you found?
Yeah, so our project is called Transparent Replications. If you're interested in following these replications as we do them to see which psychology results hold up and which don't, you can go to replications.clearthinking.org. But the basic idea of our project is we want to shift incentives in the way people do science. And to do that, we want to do replications shortly after a paper is published in a top journal to see how well the paper can be replicated, but also to see how well it does on other metrics. And the idea is if we can do enough of these right after papers are published, then we can shift incentives where it's not good enough to merely get published. You have to get published and also grapple with the fact that there's a decent probability that someone's going to go carefully check their work and make sure it holds up. So that's our aim. And we have done 9 of these replications so far. We have a bunch more that we're in the middle of that are ongoing. And we've got some really interesting and kind of surprising findings, which is we expected lots and lots of failures to replicate, right? That's if you look at the data from 10 years ago when people did started doing a bunch of replication studies, you would see lots and lots of replication failures. But we're not finding that many replication failures. In fact, we only have really one major replication failure out of these first 9 that we've conducted. It's kind of shocking.
Well, that is shocking. That's interesting. So 2 things. One, I think this is a great effort. I've often thought, like, if we could somehow, magically make the world different than it is, if any scientific finding was published, like you'd have to wait a year before it was actually published in the news media. So it would be in an academic journal. Some academic would have to replicate it, and then it would be sort of released to the world, and then they'd have a better sense of whether it's true or not. So I think this is a great initiative, and I'm happy someone's out there trying to do it. So now you said it's sort of 1 out of 9, which is a much lower percentage than the 30, 40, 50% sometimes we hear in other domains. Do you have any thoughts about why that might be?
Yeah, now I should say, of course, 9 is not that many. We have a whole bunch more we're doing, so we're going to obviously keep evaluating this and see if it holds up. But at least initially, it was pretty surprising to us that we have only had really one major failure to replicate. And I will also say that one failure to replicate does not seem to be due to p-hacking.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, it seems to be due to a kind of complex confounding effect in the experimental design. It's a really complicated reason that it seems to not replicate. So that seems that 0 out of 9 were due to p-hacking. What the heck is going on? Isn't the whole field full of p-hacking? Isn't that why we can't trust it? So what we realized as we were doing these is that even though we're getting good replication rates, which is awesome and suggests the field has made progress and really may be improving, a bunch of the papers we still did not feel were very high quality. And so that really got us thinking, well, what if we're saying we're not learning very much from this paper, but it's replicating, what's going wrong? And so we ended up developing these 2 other ratings. One is called transparency, and that basically has to do with our ability to get everything we needed to really redo the experiment. Because if for science to work in a self-correcting fashion, other people have to be able to go do the science that someone else claimed to see if it holds up. And so if a paper is very untransparent, it's very hard to actually go redo the science. So that's the first additional rating beyond replicability. But the next rating we introduced, which I think is even more important, is what we call clarity. And the idea of clarity is, imagine comparing side by side the claims the paper made about what they found and what they actually found. In other words, the actual statistical results they reported. And if the gap is small, in other words, if the claims are very similar to what the statistics showed, that's good. If on the other hand, there's a really big gap between them, their claims are not matching what they actually demonstrated in their paper. And so we find that many more papers are having bad clarity ratings than are doing badly on these other ratings, on the replicability and transparency. So to me, this suggests that there may be a new frontier in improving research, which has to do with what we call it importance hacking. So it's an analogy to p-hacking, whereas p-hacking is about doing shoddy statistics that make a false positive seem like a real result. Importance hacking is making a result that's actually not interesting, not valuable, seem interesting and valuable to push it through peer review so that you can get it published. So you're finding something that's not actually worth publishing, but you kind of sneak it through peer review by making claims about your result that's different than the result itself.
Well, yeah, that's very interesting. I have various thoughts, see if I can remember all of them. So I think that's also great that you're breaking it down further. I initially was thinking, well, maybe the reason is that, as you know, the field has kind of improved, right? There's been a greater push towards pre-registered trials. This is where before someone's going to engage in an experiment, they lay out what they expect to find, often done much more in like the, medical or pharmacological science and literature. But in this case, I think you've made a great point because let's be honest, yes, there's science, which is supposed to be a different type of domain than say advertising, but almost everyone has a tendency to inflate what they found. And so when your one is trying to discuss what a paper has found, there's the statistical results that are in the paper, that's a finding, but there's also how it is described in the, the abstract or the discussion, which is what you're also looking at and seeing if there's, say, a difference between these two, which I imagine would be sometimes difficult perhaps to quantify, qualify, but the work can be done to show whether those things line up. And I think that's a very interesting angle. And I, hindsight bias, but I'm like, yeah, that seems like it would happen in almost every paper, even ones that found very significant things. Would they even sort of hype those up even more so?
Right. So one concern that we have is that imagine that the standard for getting tenured jobs does not change, right? So you need a certain number of publications in top journals. But it's very hard to have wonderful papers that have genuine insights about the world. That's just, of course, everyone wants to do that, but it's very, very difficult. So it seems 10 to 15 years ago, a lot of people were resorting to p-hacking, not necessarily consciously, but at least subconsciously. And that was part of how they produced these papers. Well, what happens when you make it harder to p-hack and you change the norms? Well, you still have to get the same number of publications. Do you just become smarter and suddenly have way more insights? Or does something else happen? And, I like to use the metaphor of a pipe. Imagine you have a pipe with multiple leaks and you go fix one of the leaks. The problem is with only fixing one leak, now the water pressure is just higher through the other leaks, right?
Yeah.
So until you get all the leaks fixed to a reasonable degree, you're just spraying more water out the other. And so a concern I have is that we might have greater and greater issues of clarity and importance hacking as p-hacking becomes harder and harder to do because people still got to get their publications, right?
Ooh, you basically now have your own meta hypothesis about replication research, which I do like. And that does seem to make sense to me because, well, I don't know if most people know this, but a published paper is often read by no one on average. There's a lot of journals out there, there's a lot of science published, and a lot of people just don't read a lot of these results. So to have an important result or important finding to get attention, there'd be a huge incentive to, play up the results and get more attention for it. But as you sort of pointed out, it's not like the world, it's not like there's a lot of new foundational things to find, right? A lot of science has done the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. Of course, there's new domains and, new technology about like psychologically, how might people interact with TikTok or something like this, right? Which hasn't been done in the past. But I can see how it might be increasingly difficult for thousands or millions of researchers to try to find new things in all these different domains and ever dwindling supply, so to speak.
Right. And even if the supply of findings doesn't dwindle, right? Even if it's just the same rate, if people used to be using p-hacking to get enough publications, right? Mm-hmm. Well, what are they going to do? Just have fewer publications now? Well, they're just not going to get the jobs, right?
Right. More researchers and less p-hacking. And so there's a lot of competition pressure here.
Right. And so if we think about this idea of importance hacking, one of the key things about it is that it has to get things by reviewers. Because if the reviewer, like people might think, oh, reviewers are just your cronies. They're just, want to get your paper accepted. Totally not true. As someone who's, submitted a bunch of papers, and if you can ask anyone who's submitted a lot of papers, reviewers can be really brutal. Like they can. They're typically anonymous. They really don't have much incentive to be nice. And if they think your paper sucks, they generally will tell you, and they'll tell the editor, and they'll say it shouldn't be published. So in order for this strategy of importance hacking to cause publications, it has to be pretty subtle, where a reviewer who's generally not downloading the data and poking at it, but really just reading your paper, will kind of not pick up on it and think that the result has more value than it really does. Whereas really, if they really dug into the details and really understood a deep level, maybe they'd say, you know what, maybe this is just not valuable enough to publish.
Yeah, I was going to add that I think sometimes, you can let me know if this still might be the case, that for some subfields of psychology, it can be very specialized such that there's only a few experts. So the other expert might be reviewing your material to see if it is so-called a significant contribution to the work or not, but they might be your rival. And so you might have some odd competitive dynamics in that case as well.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, if anything, there can be times when peer review is too harsh. I mean, there was a crazy study done where they took papers that had already been published in journals and resubmitted them to the same journals to see if they'd publish them.
Oh, yes.
And, some of them, they realized, oh, wait, we've already published this, right? But some of the journals, they just didn't realize it because, maybe it's a different editor or whatever, or it had been published a number of years ago. And what was really striking is that very often these papers were rejected, even though the journal had already published them. So it suggests that, peer review, while it does miss a lot of things, I think the reality is it's pretty strict in the sense that if you put in something that's just total crap, it's very likely to be rejected by peer review. And it can be harsh in a pretty arbitrary way where, like, depending on what reviewers you got, it might have gotten accepted or it might have gotten rejected.
Yes, I think this is an important sort of caveat or nuance that as much as we're complaining about one aspect of it, it doesn't mean it's easy and clear sailing through any other part of this. It just means that we're trying to increase, we'll say, the rigor and clarity in all domains.
Right. And I think that peer review does serve an important function in that it does weed out a bunch of low-quality research. It's just that certain kinds of low-quality research is not very good for weeding out, right? So, it's sort of, you think of it as a net that's designed to catch certain types of fish, but doesn't catch other types of fish. And hence, you could have rampant p-hacking, and that used to get through peer review a lot.
Right. Or now you see, I guess, AI-generated or at least partially AI-generated papers being published. So clearly something's going wrong somewhere.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see if those actually get published in top journals or if they only get in low-tier journals. Because obviously, there's hundreds or there's so many journals, and some of them just have very, very bad vetting mechanisms.
Of course.
But if we start to see that going in the top journals, that's very, very worrisome.
Yeah, the financial incentives are misaligned all over the place for publishing in general. Okay, but so why don't we talk about maybe one of the two findings that you did replicate that you thought were really cool?
Yeah, absolutely. And part of our goal is really to celebrate awesome work and to push it out there and make the public more aware of it. One paper actually we did really recently that I thought was a very interesting paper it's called The Surprise of Reaching Out.
Okay.
Appreciated more than we think. And in this paper, what they did is they looked at, do people think that others will want to hear from them who they haven't heard from them for a while? And on the flip side, do people want to hear from those acquaintances they haven't heard from for a while? And so the kind of the idea of the paper is to say, maybe people actually, our acquaintances, are more likely to want to hear from us than we think they are. right? And so it's kind of a clever design where by comparing how much people want to hear from their acquaintances to how much people think their acquaintances want to hear from them, they're able to look at it and say, there's actually a divergence here. And it seems like actually our acquaintances on average probably want to hear from us more than we realize. So it's kind of quite a nice paper. We had really good, perfect transparency, perfect replicability. We replicated all the results and very good clarity as well.
Well, that's excellent. And that is a nice finding, right? Because it's sort of conforms with how we might want the world to be, that we might feel a bit, anxious or wary of reaching out. But it turns out, on average, perhaps it's better to do it than to not do it.
Yeah, and I think it's also a really nice finding because, it says something about the world that people actually care about. So, it also has that potential value aspect. Whereas, other papers that we look at, they don't necessarily have a bearing on real life, even if the finding replicates.
Yes, right. Yeah, there's interesting findings that may be less applicable to the average person as they navigate through their day. So as we think about these different issues and the work you're doing, I wondered if you have thoughts about how we can make the field better or any future directions you're exploring.
Yeah, so I really think that what we're doing should be done by journals. Like, I really hope that the journals put us out of business and just start randomly sampling their own papers and evaluating them really carefully.
Yes.
Because the reality is reviewers, they're doing this for free. Like, I don't know if people realize that. The people who review papers do it for free. They don't even get paid. And so to ask the reviewers to spend, 20 hours, gathering the data, reanalyzing everything, picking the whole thing apart, or even replicating it is totally unrealistic. But the journals could do this, and they don't have to do it with every paper. Imagine just, 20% of papers selected at random. They were to run it through a careful process like ours. They could completely change the way researchers practice. They could make science way more reliable, and they can make it so that when you read a paper in a top journal, you can really believe that not only will it replicate, but it actually means what it claims to mean, right? And I think that's really where science should go. In the meantime, we're going to try to do our project to kind of shift incentives, but we really want others to adopt it as a model that they can then apply. And it could be applied in a lot of different fields. We're doing it in psychology, but we hope others replicate it in other areas.
I think that's great. And I wish you keep going. And I hope, actually, again, someone puts you out of business, Spencer. Well, if people want to find more about your work and what you're up to, what should they do? Where should they go?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, I'd love it if listeners would check out my podcast, Clearer Thinking with Spencer Greenberg. You can find it in any podcast app. Every week I invite a really interesting thinker to come talk to me. I ask them to pick 5 ideas that really matter and we discuss them. You can hear Darren on it, which is a really fun discussion. And you can also check out our website, clearerthinking.org, where we have over 80 free tools that teach you all kinds of skills around habit formation, goal setting, and critical thinking. And you can check out the Transparent Replications website, where you can see all of our applications.
Thanks so much for joining us, Spencer Greenberg.
Thanks for having me.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.